Mr. Speaker, I rise in relation to the motion before us, the one standing in the name of the Honourable Member, Dr. Ashni K. Singh, Minister of Finance, and which seeks the approval of this House for the eventual spending of $194,343,000,000 plus several $100,000, being the estimate of expenses for financial year 2013. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to begin my contribution by making a reference to something that was said by the previous speaker, Honourable Minister of Public Works. The Honourable Minister did say that it was not his intention to wax Shakespearean, but what he did wax on was the question of road safety and road fatalities. Apart from the fact that I'm not so sure what road safety and road fatalities have to do with today's budget, Mr. Speaker, I noticed that the Minister also referred to the building of or the widening of the East Bank Road into a 4-lane road, and touting this as part of infrastructural projects which, even though they consume vast amounts of money, the benefits of which are unclear. By that I mean, Mr. Speaker, currently the 4-lane expansion begins at the Penitence and it goes all the way to the Demerara Harbour Bridge. But on either side of those 4 lanes, and at any one time, can be found encumbrances. So we are spending, here it is, we are spending lots of money, and as I said, the benefits are unclear because motorists and consumers don't have access to 4 lanes. There's invariably an obstruction of one kind or another going in both directions. So I believe, Mr. Speaker, it is this institutional weakness and lack of capacity that my colleague, Honourable Member Mr. Greenwich, spoke of earlier that is hindering development.
Should the obstruction be removed?
It should have been part of a program in the first place, Mr. Speaker, to see if indeed the expenditure, if the expansion was cited in the proper place, or if it should have been a totally different roadway. Mr. Speaker, we sat and listened to the Honourable Minister present Budget 2013 last Monday. A presentation that lasted almost 200 minutes, 188 in fact. A budget that the Minister boasted is the largest ever in our country's history, of $208.8 billion, and under a theme that surely is a misnomer given the exclusionary nature of its formulation. It seems to me, Mr. Speaker, and I am informed by experience and lessons of history, that one should not boast of size, but if at all, of effectiveness, or in this instance, what the proposed expenditure of over $1 billion will do to develop our country, create jobs, raise living standards, address the structural imbalance of our economy, improve access to and the level of education and health services, public safety and public security, reverse the deteriorating state of basic physical and economic infrastructure, address and arrest the spiraling cost of living, as well as the plight of the poor and vulnerable, including old and young, unemployed females and males, especially those without education, to inform us, Mr. Speaker, how this expenditure will reduce the large numbers of employed poor, and to see that there will be better pay and conditions of work for those poor, as well as nurses, teachers, and public servants. Of how this massive expenditure will make a dent on the present prominence of crime and drugs, the prevalence of discrimination and corruption, of the widening income and wealth disparities within this society, Mr. Speaker. Sad to say, Mr. Speaker, the priority and preferences that the Honourable Minister has presented to this House does not meaningfully address the above concerns in any structured manner. But these are all issues of grave concerns to us in a partnership for national unity, leading as they do to a de facto simmering rebellion and widespread feelings of discrimination and alienation amongst the population. Under the Minister's recipe, we can expect more of the same. Cronyism, corruption, and incompetence, where political loyalty trumps merit. We are told that a few so-called flagship projects, these include building of the Marriott Hotel, the expansion of the Czech Jagan International Airport, which the Honourable Minister just waxed defiantly, I may add, on the Milo Falls hydro project, are going to solve the structural imbalances of our economy. Projects that have not been the subject of independent technical appraisal. Mr. Speaker, I would have thought that the fiasco of the Skelton Sugar Factory would have been of salutary value, but evidently it is not so. The financial plan and management of the economy ought to be informed by a vision. In our opinion, it should be one that places people at its center. Therefore, it ought to address factors such, as I have said, jobs for our people, improved living standards, improved basic infrastructure, good quality education and accessible by all. In short, Mr. Speaker, human development as opposed to growth benefiting just a few. A central component of this vision has to include, indeed encompass a vision for the development of the 10 regions of our country. I submit, Mr. Speaker, that the fashioning of such a plan can only be arrived at by way of meaningful engagement with the 10 regional governments that exist. Regrettably, it is necessary that I remind the Honourable Minister and the government that he is a part of a few truths. First is that he holds the office that he does and derives his legitimacy from the election held on November 28, 2011. Those elections were known as general and regional elections, and electors were required to cast 2 ballots. It brought into being a central government and 10 regional governments. Mr. Speaker, under our Constitution, which is the supreme law, the role of local democratic organs is clearly defined. Article 12 states that, and I quote, "Local government by freely elected representatives of the people is an integral part of the democratic organization of the state," unquote. Chapter 7, which is titled Local Democracy, containing Articles 71 to 78b, is explicit. Article 71(1) states that, and again I quote, "Local government is a vital aspect of democracy and shall be organized so as to involve as many people as possible in the task of managing and developing the communities in which they live," end of quote. And most germane is Article 77, which states, open quotation, "The development program of each region shall be integrated into the national development plans, and the government shall allocate funds to each region to enable it to develop its development program," end of quote. The government, therefore, has not just a moral obligation to meaningfully engage the duly and democratically constituted RDCs, but a constitutional duty to do so. The minister, in his speech of 69 pages, made no reference to any such consultations or engagement, nor did he even allude to any such exercise. The table of contents of his speech lists 7 headings, beginning with an introduction and ending with a conclusion. In the former, even though the Honourable Minister saw it necessary to indulge in polemics directed against the majority of members of this House, there is no mention there of engagements with the 10 RDCs or of a plan or vision for regional development and or hinterland development. There is reference to, I quote, ongoing stakeholder engagements, unquote. But it does not identify who these stakeholders are. Later in his conclusion, the minister qualified what was the prerequisite to be considered a stakeholder. But I'll get to that later. In his conclusion though, there is a solitary reference to the hinterland, and it is that 10,601 hinterland families now enjoy solar electricity as a result of the hinterland electrification program. With regard to this project, Mr. Speaker, in Stabbook News of March 31, that was some 3 days ago, there's a photograph of a solar system installation at the Kako Primary School. But the accompanying text informs us that while this installation was done in December 2012, it has never worked. I do not know if this particular solar system is one of the 10,601 that the Honorable Minister referred to. But given this revelation, I would say that if one were to hyphenate the word solar, you would get a totally different interpretation of the worth of this initiative. On the other side of the spectrum, Mr. Speaker, the former regional chairman of Region 8 openly boasts of having 13 solar installations in his home in Paramakatoy. APNU will be calling for an audit of this project and of the 10,601 recipients to learn of its usefulness, efficacy, its cost effectiveness, etc. In between those two headings, Mr. Speaker, and I'm referring to the table of contents of the Minister's budget speech, there are the following: global economic developments, domestic macroeconomic developments, and they're listed as A to G, big A to big G. There's sectoral developments and the agenda for 2013, listed as A to H with many subheadings, totaling 44 in fact. There are targets for 2013, and then finally there are the measures. In all of this, there is only one heading specifically addresses hinterland or regional issues, and it is at 4 decimal capital E decimal common F Roman 6, or paragraphs 4 decimal 100 to 102, entitled Indigenous Communities. In these 3 paragraphs, the Honorable Minister informs us that the government's aim, and I quote, is to ensure that the economies of Amerindian villages are put on a more sustainable path and that improved social services are delivered to their communities. In this regard, the respective programs and allocations in 2012 were the following: $160 million for community development interventions in areas of ecotourism, provision of agricultural tools, provision of means of transportation, and establishment of village offices. $4.4 million expended to support agricultural, aquaculture, and beekeeping projects under the National Hinterland Secure Livelihood Program. That 362 students benefited from the Hinterland Scholarship Program, and 62 students graduated from secondary and technical institutions. That's it for 2012, Mr. Speaker. For 2013, the following interventions are proposed to advance development of our Amerindian communities. $77.9 million for the land titling and demarcation program, $350 million for the commencement of implementation of 180 community development plans, $66 million towards the Hinterland Scholarship Program, $200 million to support an Amerindian youth entrepreneurship and apprenticeship scheme, and $500 million to roll out the OMPF to Amerindian villages. There we have it, Mr. Speaker. What I have just outlined is all that the Honourable Minister chose to highlight in his budget speech with regard to the government's plans, vision, program and initiatives related to hinterland and regional development. The question needs to be asked. If you listen, Mr. Honourable PM, you'll find out. The question needs to be asked, is this a suitable or an acceptable vision for the development of the regions under the hinterland? I say the answer is an emphatic no. Mr. Speaker, poverty is widespread in hinterland communities. Sad to say, the gold and other extractive resources that are being dug out from hinterland areas bring very little benefits to the residents of the nearby communities. What accompanies much of this mining activity are various public health crises, such as the gastroenteritis outbreak recently in Region 1, arising from poor regulation and sanitation, antisocial activities such as prostitution, higher cost of living for those not involved in mining itself due to higher prices for basic necessities, increased criminal activity, unsafe waterways, and there have even been deaths due to caving in of mining pits. Mr. Speaker, what is needed is a comprehensive approach to the needs of the regions and of hinterland communities. But this task has to be approached from the bottom up, not top down. In other words, the regional governments have to be meaningfully engaged to identify their priorities. Not what currently obtains, which is central government unilaterally deciding what hinterland communities will receive. Such as example, an inadequate laptop when young people cannot even get jobs. We have to find out who are actually benefiting from these interventions. The suppliers of goods and the providers of services, or the hinterland residents. Seeking to place hinterland economies on a sustainable path has to be a priority of any government if we are to do justice to the expectations of our people. Mr. Speaker, I am by no means saying that this budget makes no provision for allocation of funding to 10 regions. It does, and let us look at same. A total of $22.054 billion is allocated to all 10 regions, made up of $19.54 billion for current expenditure and $2.601 billion for capital expenditure. To this is to be added the $1.371 billion allocated to the Ministry of Local Government and Regional Development, for a grand total of $23.426 billion. I see the Honourable Minister is looking intently as if he wants to correct me. To the regions and the subject ministry. This compares with a total of $21.774 billion allocated in 2012, or an increase of 7.6%. Mr. Speaker, by and of itself, this percentage increase says nothing. We have to look within the figures to see what they tell us. The first observation is that the total capital allocation of $2.6 billion to all 10 regions represents 1.25% of the total budget, same as in 2012. Mr. Speaker, clearly a lot more than $2.6 billion are budgeted to be spent for capital works throughout the country, with expenditure under different program heads and via different subject ministries. The objective clearly is twofold, i.e., one, to miniaturize the scope and authority of the 10 regional governments, and more importantly, to increase the profile of the central government, making it to be the sole center of authority, and where all have to look toward for access to state resources. The fountainhead, Mr. Speaker. The government makes no pretense to disguise this phenomenon. Mr. Speaker, the one of miniaturizing the role and authority of all other institutions, whether it is this National Assembly itself or other constitutional bodies such as RDCs, NDCs, etc. And conversely, presenting the executive branch of government to be the giver of all. Mr. Speaker, you as well as members of this Honourable House will be aware that I have submitted questions numbered 105 to 113 to various ministers dealing with this very issue. The question to the Minister of Foreign Affairs, for example, seeks an explanation as to why no members from the majority or opposition in the National Assembly are members of the joint Guyana-Brazil Working Infrastructure Group, which met in Guyana at the end of February this year. The one to the Honourable Minister of Amerindian Affairs similarly sought an explanation as to why, when she visited communities in the North Pacaraimans in late 2012 and earlier this year, she had two members of the appointed element of the regional administration, namely the REO and the recently appointed DREO, accompanying her and did not invite the RDC of Region 8 to nominate at least one of its members to be a part of her delegation. The question the Minister of Health was asked was why it was that the medical team that was deployed to several communities in Region 7 in January and February of this year did not consult with or engage prior to their deployment or subsequently the RDC of Region 7. These actions tell their own story, Mr. Speaker, and it is that the government sees no need to operate within the constitutional framework. Rather, that it has no compunction in violating the dictates of the Constitution. That they are happy to operate via the back door. When I made a similar observation last year in my response to the 2012 budget speech, this is what the Honorable Minister of Local Government had to say, and I quote. This is the Minister speaking last year. Mr. Speaker, please permit me to assure the Honorable Member, Mr. Bulkan, that the PPPC government does not breach the Constitution of Guyana and has no intention to do so. The systems, procedures, and processes established within the present legal framework for the consultations, compilations, preparation, and presentation of this budget were all followed. The program heads, be it education, administration, public works, health, or agriculture, had to present their respective budgets to the relevant subcommittees of the RDCs after consultation with their various constituencies. After those presentations from subcommittee level, the proposals were taken to the RDCs. There, the debates and discussion continued, and after approval, those draft budgets were presented to the ministry and then on to the respective subject ministries. The Minister ended by saying, "I am willing to guide the Honourable Member through the process, but time does not permit." End of quote. Mr. Speaker, I am now informing this House that those were but empty words. In fact, so hollow was that statement that the budgetary submission of Region 8 was not endorsed by either the chairman or any member of that council. It was a clandestine submission of the REO and one that was accepted by the ministry. The regional chairman made several attempts to find out from the ministry why this unauthorized submission was accepted, but to no avail. Mr. Speaker, it is very important that these practices and actions be brought to the attention of this House and to the public as they strike at the heart of good governance. It informs the legislature and the nation of the philosophy and mindset that pervades the executive, which is that they will be a law unto themselves, even to the extent of making it up as they go along. I will provide another example to illustrate this point. It is when the Honourable Member Dr. Ramsamy, Minister of Agriculture, answered questions in this House on December 20th of last year, seeking to justify supplementary spending. The Honourable Minister's explanation was that the ministry was taking on more and more of the responsibilities of municipalities and NDCs. It is here in the 32nd sitting of the Hansard, Mr. Speaker, on page 7094. The Honourable Minister went on to add that there is a danger that persons who they are helping would expect that to be the norm. This is why I refer to a mindset, Mr. Speaker. It is one of displacing local authorities and executing a program of central control, hijacking the process, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, last year I called on the government to cease this invidious practice of breaching provisions of the Constitution. I do so once more. Again as well, I call on the government to engage local democratic organs as mandated by the Constitution and to see that projects in the regions are not the sole responsibility of a handful of unelected ministry officials. Before I move off on the capital allocations, and paltry as they are, I will point out that the two highest allocations are to Region 6 and Region 2 at 383 million and 367 million respectively, or two regions controlled by the PPPC. And the regions receiving the two lowest allocations are Regions 8 and 7 at 151 million and 134 million respectively, both being opposition-dominated regions. In the case of Region 4, which has the largest population by far, its allocation is less than all the regions with the exception of the two just named. and the signal is unmistakable, which is that the central government will exercise a steel heel on the opposition-controlled RDCs, perhaps in the vain expectation that voters in these regions will someday see the error of their ways and switch allegiance to the PPPC. It's not going to happen, Mr. Speaker. Let us now examine the proposals for current expenditure for the 10 regions, Mr. Speaker. A total of 19.453 billion is allocated under this heading. As is the case with capital allocations, Region 6 once more heads the list with an allocation of 3.785 billion, followed by Regions 4 and 3. Bottom of the list is Region 8, which is the only of the 10 regions with a proposed allocation of less than 1 billion, 735 million in fact. This money is allocated under 5 program heads, namely Admin and Finance, Public Works, Education, Health, and Agriculture. Again, Mr. Speaker, if we look within the figures, it becomes more informative. We notice the following: that about 61% goes to one program head, that is education. Next is health, which receives about 20%. Administration and finance receives about the same amount as public works and agriculture, at roughly 6% each. There is no allocation for agriculture for 4 regions, these being regions 1, 7, 8, and 10. Mr. Speaker, time constraints will allow me to make just 2 comments. Namely, 1, for the 4 regions in which there are no allocations for agriculture, a total of $389 million are spent only for dietary provision, this being meals for school children. Some of this expenditure could be tied to supporting agricultural activities in these 4 regions. This will result in job creation, helping to build hinterland economies, and the provision of a healthier diet and better nutrition for hinterland students. I would rather suspect that right now, much of their diet consists of a lot of refined foods, which will, I heard the Honorable Minister of Health speaking recently, which will lead to health problems later on. My other observation relates to the stipend paid to regional councillors, which is currently $10,000 monthly. Mr. Speaker, there are a total of 205 councillors across the regions, which would mean that the total paid to all councillors, or rather I should say supposed to, come to that later, is $24.6 million annually, if my math is correct. Mr. Speaker, the allocation to regional administration and finance is $1,127 million plus a further $100 million under the capital. But the councillors, who are expected to be the backbone of the system, receive a mere $25 million, or 2% of it. What is democratic about this, Mr. Speaker? Is this the government's understanding of Article 12 of the Constitution, which I read earlier? Or Article 77, which mandates that the government shall allocate funds to each region to enable it to implement its development program by being stingy towards the elected councillors? Councillors who are put there by the people to represent their interests? Mr. Speaker, we are calling for this figure to be set at $30,000 monthly as from the next budget. We must not only favor the appointed element of the regional administration, we have to reward the councillors who the people have placed their trust in. Incidentally, Mr. Speaker, none of the opposition councillors from Region 8 were paid stipends for 5 months of last year, nor any for 2013. It defies rational explanation, Mr. Speaker. An entire region is being punished, it seems, because residents there turned their backs on the PPPC the last elections. But those people are resilient, Mr. Speaker. And again, as my colleague, Honorable Member Granite said earlier, reminded us about his grandmother saying that the Lord does not sleep. And those voters are waiting once again for the opportunity to demonstrate how they feel. I do not know, Mr. Speaker, if the PPP councillors are in receipt of their stipend, as the REO of this region, Mr. Harsiwak, who is supposed to be the clerk of the council, does not volunteer any information to the IBC, particularly in relation to finance, And in this, he seems to have the support of his superiors. Mr. Speaker, I would now like to look at some of the interventions that receive funding.
Honorable Member, your time is up. You need to have an extension of 10 minutes to conclude.
Well, I heard two proposals of 5.
I am proposing 10 minutes.
No, so yes, I was going to take a combined proposal. I asked the honorable member to give me 10 minutes to conclude.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, people.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in the 2012 budget, I will look at one region, Region 8. And it is important for us to look at the proposed funding because the Honourable Minister, when he spoke last year, boasted that with regards to the 2011 budget allocations, 96.1% was spent on the capital side and 98.1% on the current side. Overall, according to the Honourable Minister, for allocations to the Ministry and the regions, 99.1% was spent, quote, in fulfilling the programs and projects identified in Budget 2011, unquote. The Honourable Minister was very proud of this and seemed to equate expenditure with development. The lawyers may say ipso facto, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on the capital side, $350 million, reference number 350, $5 million were budgeted for land and water transportation. The RDC of that region is unsure if that money was spent and what it was spent on. A further $40 million was allocated for two bridges at Tumong and Ireng, Project 352. It appears that to date no work has commenced. A further $40 million was allocated for 5 interventions under Capital Project 354. Of these, just one was partially executed, which is very minor repairs to Madhya Dorms. Nothing that can cost anywhere than $9 million that was budgeted for that particular rehab. $15.963 million was allocated to build a health post in Princeville and to extend one at Kurukabaru. Again, very minor works was done, and it appears that the contract for the one at Kurukabaru was terminated. $2.5 million was approved for installation of a solar system at the medics quarters at Cato. Again, it's unclear. $8 million was voted to buy a Model M Bedford truck and an ATV, reference number 358, for the Madhya Health Services. Neither was bought. Mr. Speaker, a further $56.4 million was budgeted on the current side for maintenance of infrastructure. The Public Works 6251-55. For works on roads, bridges, DNI, sea defense, etc. Again, it appears that none of these works were carried out. Yet, Mr. Speaker, when the Council successfully carried a motion confidence against the REO of Region 8 for non-cooperation, the government did nothing. Mr. Speaker, whilst I have provided but a few examples and in only one region, I am convinced that this region is not an exception. I have witnessed the behavior of this particular ministry ever since I entered this parliament, and I understand their DNA. They have no respect for local democracy. They believe in central control. Mr. Speaker, there are many other areas in this budget that I would have liked to have addressed, but time does not permit me. Include, of course, the sugar industry, GPL, and others. But there is one that I cannot allow to go unnoticed, Mr. Speaker, and it has to do with the national census, which is dealt with in paragraphs 4.137 and 138 of the Minister's budget speech. We are informed by the Honourable Minister that this census started on September 15th of last year, and that the field enumeration exercise was concluded in December 2012. The Honourable Minister goes on to tell us, and I'm quoting his words, the first deliverable of the census, the preliminary quick count, which is a quick count of the population, is expected to be produced in the 4th quarter of this year. By the Minister's admission, Mr. Speaker, it will take 1 year or possibly longer to produce a quick count of a population of less than 1 million. What does this say about us as a nation, Mr. Speaker? I heard the Minister speak about an image. The other minister spoke of building a new Guyana. Mr. Speaker, earlier I referred to what according to the finance minister, is the requirement of the government to be accepted as a stakeholder. It is given in paragraph 7.1, and it is that one needs to be, and I quote, like-minded. It will take more time than I have already spoken, Mr. Speaker, to try to explain the philosophy that informs such a statement, so I cannot even begin. Previous speaker said loser takes all. Mr. Speaker, Budget 2013 suffers from the same terminal defect as Budget 2012, which is that it arose out of an illegitimate process, given that the majority of the legislature was shut out of the process. In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, my closing remark is that this budget deserves to be declared DOA, dead on arrival. I do not recommend this. Thank you.